Tonight, we're witnessing a moment that has sent shockwaves through Washington, NATO, and intelligence agencies across the globe. For the first time in months, perhaps even years, Russia has issued a direct and explicit threat against US forces. This isn't the usual saber-rattling or ambiguous rhetoric that often comes from the Kremlin. This is targeted, specific language, delivered in the wake of a Ukrainian military strike that Russia is now blaming squarely on the United States. The reaction in Washington has been swift and serious: heightened military readiness, urgent closed door briefings, and a level of urgency that the US has not shown at any previous point in this war. What we're seeing tonight is not an escalation on the battlefield or in the skies above Ukraine, but in the tense diplomatic and military space between two nuclear powers. The trigger was a devastating Ukrainian strike that destroyed a major Russian military asset deep behind enemy lines. The evidence is clear. Video footage shows a massive fireball erupting from the center of the facility, followed by secondary explosions and thick plumes of smoke visible for miles. The blast was so powerful that seismic stations in the region registered a small tremor. According to Ukrainian intelligence, the strike eliminated several high-ranking Russian officers, destroyed critical equipment, and disrupted Russian command operations in the area. Normally, Russia would follow a familiar playbook: deny, distract, blame Ukraine, and downplay the damage. But this time, the Kremlin's response was different and far more dangerous. Russian officials issued multiple statements blaming the United States for the strike. Russian state television claimed that US satellites provided the targeting data. Military spokesmen insisted that the missiles used could not have been launched without American specialists. Then came the most alarming part. Russia warned that American forces operating near the conflict zone could now be considered legitimate targets. Those two words, legitimate targets, set off alarms in Washington. According to Pentagon insiders, that phrase triggered an immediate reassessment of force protection measures across US bases in Europe and the Black Sea region. US forces in Romania, Poland, Germany, and the Eastern Mediterranean were reportedly placed on heightened alert. Surveillance flights increased, naval assets were repositioned, missile defense systems recalibrated, and intelligence sharing intensified. The US embassies in several countries quietly updated their security postures. The message was clear. The United States understood the seriousness of Russia's threat and was preparing for the possibility that it might be carried out. Why did Russia choose this moment to escalate? The answer is not random or accidental. It is a direct response to something the Kremlin cannot tolerate: the perception that the United States played even a partial role in Ukraine's successful strike. Russia knows that if Ukraine can consistently hit deep strategic targets, Moscow loses its ability to control the war's momentum. By blaming the US, the Kremlin is trying to shift the narrative and intimidate Washington into pulling back its support for Ukraine. This tells us something crucial. The Ukrainian strike was devastating enough to provoke a dramatic Russian reaction. Western intelligence sources have provided more details about the operation. The Ukrainian attack reportedly used a combination of drones and long-range missiles, likely Storm Shadow or ATACMS, launched in a coordinated sequence to overwhelm Russian air defenses. Such an operation requires meticulous planning, timing, and precision. Russia's accusations suggest that the US provided targeting data. Publicly, Washington denies this. Privately, officials say Ukraine has become highly capable of conducting these operations independently. But Russia needs a scapegoat, and the United States is the obvious choice. Inside Russia, the reaction has been chaotic. Ultranationalist bloggers and propagandists, who shape much of the domestic war narrative, began calling for Russia to shoot down US drones over the Black Sea, target American troops stationed in Romania, and even launch cyber attacks on NATO command networks. One influential commentator declared, "If America helps Ukraine kill our officers, then Americans must be ready to die too." That statement went viral in Russia and immediately raised concerns within the US intelligence community. Rhetoric like this, especially from voices close to the Kremlin, often reflects internal discussions happening behind closed doors. US intelligence agencies are now monitoring a surge in Russian military communications, particularly between the Black Sea Fleet Command and units stationed in Syria and the Eastern Mediterranean. One senior official told reporters that Russian forces may be preparing unpredictable responses. Another revealed that US aircraft were rerouted earlier today after a Russian fighter jet flew dangerously close. Washington is taking these developments seriously, so is NATO, and Ukraine is watching closely, fully aware that Russia is trying to intimidate the US into backing off. Russia is attempting to draw a red line, implying that any American involvement, even indirect, could be met with military retaliation. But so far, the US response has been firm: no change in policy, no reduction in support, and no acknowledgement of Russia's claims. According to sources familiar with the Situation Room briefing, President Biden was unequivocal: "We will not be threatened out of supporting Ukraine." But that doesn't mean Washington isn't preparing for the worst. Across Europe, US bases have increased flight patrols, naval movements have shifted, intelligence assets are monitoring Russian submarines more closely. American radars in Poland and Romania are tracking Russian missile activity with heightened precision. NATO's air policing missions over the Baltic have nearly doubled in the last 24 hours. Even if Russia doesn't intend to attack US forces, the risk of miscalculation and accidental escalation has increased dramatically. Let's be clear, the United States does not believe Russia wants a war with NATO. Russia cannot afford it, cannot win it, and cannot survive it politically. But threatening US forces, even rhetorically, is something Russia does when it feels cornered, exposed, and humiliated. And humiliation is exactly what this latest Ukrainian strike has delivered. According to analysts who have reviewed classified assessment photos, the Russian facility hit in the Ukrainian strike was nearly obliterated. The blast left a crater the size of a basketball court. Russian officers had to be evacuated through smoke-filled hallways, and communications equipment was melted by the intense heat. Russia's command structure in that region is now fragmented, disconnected, and scrambling to re-establish control. This was not a symbolic attack, it was a strategic blow that blinded Russian leadership in the area, shredded morale, exposed vulnerabilities, and embarrassed the Kremlin. That embarrassment is what triggered the threat against the United States. Whenever Russia threatens the US, Ukraine inevitably becomes part of the conversation, whether it wants to or not. Tonight, Ukrainian officials are balancing two realities: the success of their operation and the danger of Russia dragging the US deeper into the conflict, at least rhetorically. Ukraine knows Russia's pattern well. When Russia is losing, it blames the US. When it feels cornered, it points the finger at NATO. When it is humiliated, it issues threats. This is that pattern playing out in real time, and Ukraine is not surprised. But the real story tonight is not just Russia's threat, it's Washington's reaction. For the first time in months, American officials are openly acknowledging the possibility that Russia might act irrationally. The Pentagon has increased surveillance flights over the Black Sea. US ships in the Eastern Mediterranean have moved into new positions. American fighter jets in Europe are on a higher state of readiness. Behind all of this is a simple, urgent question: what will Russia do next? Some analysts believe Russia's threat is a bluff, an attempt to spook the United States and force a reduction in support for Ukraine. Others think Russia may attempt a provocation, such as harassing a US drone or shadowing an American naval vessel. But a smaller, more concerned group of analysts believe Russia might be preparing something more aggressive: a cyber attack on US infrastructure, a GPS jamming incident affecting American aircraft, or even a missile launch dangerously close to US bases overseas. Washington is preparing for all of these possibilities. As one official put it, Russia is angry. Angry and unstable is a dangerous combination. Meanwhile, President Putin appeared on Russian television today looking tense, defensive, and unusually agitated. He praised Russian troops, condemned Western involvement, and accused the US of pushing the world toward conflict. Analysts say this reflects the Kremlin's need to shift attention away from its own battlefield failures. That is the ultimate truth behind this threat. Russia is not making these statements from a position of strength, but from a position of weakness, insecurity, and growing fear that Ukraine's capabilities, with or without US involvement, are becoming too powerful to contain. Ukraine's strike exposed a vulnerability that Russia did not want the world to see. Tonight, Russia is lashing out the only way it can, with threats, but threats do not change the facts. The facts are that Ukraine is advancing, Russia is losing critical assets, the Kremlin is scrambling, US intelligence knows what's happening, and Washington is not backing down. The world is now watching a dangerous moment unfold. This is a moment where words from Moscow could quickly turn into actions, where miscalculation could lead to escalation. But it is also a moment where the lines are clear. The United States will protect its forces. NATO will not be intimidated, and Ukraine will continue to strike the targets it needs to strike to survive. Russia's threat against the United States tonight has been met not with fear or retreat, but with readiness. Across Europe and the Black Sea, American and NATO forces are on alert. Intelligence agencies are working overtime to monitor Russian movements and communications. Diplomats are engaged in urgent consultations. The message from Washington is unmistakable. The US will not be bullied out of supporting Ukraine. For Ukraine, this moment is both an opportunity and a risk. The success of its recent operation has demonstrated its growing military capabilities and its ability to strike high, you Russian targets. But it also means that Ukraine is now at the center of a dangerous confrontation between two nuclear powers. Ukrainian officials are keenly aware of the risks, but they also know that continued pressure on Russian forces is essential for their survival. For Russia, the situation is increasingly precarious. The loss of a major military facility, the deaths of high-ranking officers, and the disruption of command operations have all contributed to a sense of vulnerability and humiliation. The Kremlin's decision to threaten US forces is a sign of desperation, not confidence. It is an attempt to shift the narrative, to intimidate the West, and to regain some measure of control over a conflict that is slipping out of its grasp. For the United States and its allies, the challenge is to respond firmly without escalating the conflict further. That means maintaining military readiness, enhancing intelligence sharing, and sending clear signals to Moscow that any attack on US or NATO forces will be met with a decisive response. It also means continuing to support Ukraine both militarily and diplomatically, while working to prevent the conflict from spiraling into a wider war. As the world watches, the stakes could not be higher. The next moves by Russia, the United States, and Ukraine will shape the course of this conflict and the security of Europe for years to come. Tonight, the message from Washington is clear. The United States will not be intimidated. NATO will stand firm, and Ukraine will continue its fight for survival. The world is watching, and the consequences of this moment will be felt far beyond the borders of Ukraine. Stay with us as we continue to monitor this rapidly developing story.